With hindsight, I'm actually surprised to see how little my methodological preferences have changed over the course of these 16 years in which I've published these two books on the First World War. In my first book, which was on rural Bavaria, I was basically interested in the social configurations that allowed rural society to absorb the shocks and aftershocks of violence during and after the Great War in that period, in that inflationary decade ranging from 1914 to 1923. That was, in a sense, a quite deliberate attempt to put social history center stage, to look at the social configurations that allowed peasants and farmhands in Bavaria to deal with the upheaval of war and inflation, and then to develop a secondary, in a sense, a secondary argument about popular mentalities, perceptions, also religious symbolism from that core analysis. And in my second book, which is more precisely focused on practices of violence during the Great War, not an awful lot has actually changed. There is still an attempt to put the social configurations that embedded and allow to articulate violent action center stage. Obviously, over the past 20-25 years, the cultural history of the Great War has been the key methodological development, and there is a strong argument to make that an analysis of symbols, discourses, and texts can offer fascinating insights into the history of the First World War. But nevertheless, I think the methodological case for a cultural history of the Great War has been sometimes overstated. Much more important than the cultures of war, which have been discussed in much recent historiography, it is actually necessary to analyze the practices of violence. And violence, in the end, will always be and has to be analyzed as a form, a type of social action that has also physical implications. The notion of a cultural violence that has been advanced by some recent historiography is, in my view, deeply flawed. In the end, violence is physical. It has to be seen as something physical, which is the deliberate injury that perpetrators enact against the bodies of their victims. In rural Bavaria, which I studied in my first book, Catholic piety was actually a key factor providing stability and continuity during the upheaval of war, then revolution, and also inflation from 1914 to 1923. Catholic piety allowed both farmers at the home front and soldiers at the front to deal with the contingency of warfare, particularly with the contingencies of battle. It offered a language of consolation and grief for those who had lost relatives or who were facing the bereavement of war. And it also provided at the front rituals which structured the temporal patterns of warfare. But religion was not only helping Bavarians to respond to the existential personal challenges the First World War brought about, it also, and perhaps even more importantly, provided a moral language that allowed to assess political and social phenomena, and can be in many ways actually viewed quite similar to political ideologies at the time. So it provided a language that allowed to assess public morality, to look at social and economic imbalances within society, and to judge them according to factors such as greed or vice. This was quite important because through this moral language, Catholic farmers got a sense of the injustices in society, but also and that's what is very close to a political ideology, got a sense of factors that were prolonging the war. Ultimately, then this led to the issue of theodicy, which is basically the question why an almighty God would allow such gross inequalities and imbalances in wartime society. And the extent and the consequences of this notion of theodicy as it developed among pious Catholic farmers in Bavaria is actually a very important issue. And theodicy, the problem of theodicy more generally, one of the crucial issues that have to be analyzed when we discuss religion during the First World War. Quite obviously, research into the global dimension of the war and into the various occupation regimes, both at the Eastern and at the Western Front, are the most important recent trends in historiography on the Great War. In the field of religious history, I think a key insight is the role Catholic faith played in providing a space in which the national and the international could meet and intersect, in which Catholics could project their faith onto the identity space that was the nation of their respective nations, but at the same time interpret Catholicism as a transnational framework that transcended national boundaries and, in a sense, united Europeans across the board. The comparative research that Patrick Julian of the University of Chicago has conducted in that respect, comparing and looking at how German occupiers and French occupied in northern France, both coming from Catholic backgrounds, sort of interacted and used Catholicism as a joint language, is, I think, very important in that respect. The commemorative styles of various belligerent countries across Europe obviously differed according to their specific notions of citizenship and civic engagement that were prevalent in a given national framework. In an established republican system, such as in France, wartime service and dying for the fatherland were represented as civic duties that reasserted and reaffirmed the civilian identity of the soldiers. Whereas in Germany, in a much more bellicose style of commemoration and remembrance, tried to gain the upper hand in the public sphere, although there were long and protracted battles over the hegemony of specific styles of commemoration. Religion is indeed an important and largely overlooked factor in this respect, as far at least as Catholicism is concerned. We can see that Catholicism provided a symbolism of remembrance that was shared and contained similar patterns across various predominantly Catholic countries in Western Europe, such as mainly France, Austria, to some extent also Italy and in Germany. This type of commemoration had obvious political implications, but that's only one part of the story. One should not lose sight of the cultural demobilization that this type of commemoration, in a sense, facilitated and fostered, in that it avoided or held back some of the more aggressive radical nationalist or fascist styles of remembrance. At any rate, the focus and the framework of these Catholic types of remembrance were mostly local or regional, as for instance Oswald Überegger in his fascinating study on the Austrian province of Tyrolia has demonstrated, also showing the conservative political implications that this type of commemoration certainly had. Yes, indeed. I think religious history can and actually should correct the secular bias that is built into the historiography on the Great War, in which the war and its aftermath is seen primarily as a battlefield between the major secular ideologies of the 20th century, which are liberalism, fascism, and communism. That's obviously correct in a sense, but it's also massively overstated. To be sure, the First World War was in many respects actually a watershed moment in the secularization of 20th century European societies, because many soldiers from various countries, mostly those of a Protestant background, returned home with their affiliation to their faith and their church severely shattered for various reasons. But that's not the major point. I think in equal measure, the Great War has also to be seen as a period of reconsideration and reflection and in both Christian and Jewish theology. And these debates had a bearing that went far beyond the more narrow remit of theological discourse. There is also an empirical point to make here, as Friedrich Wilhelm Graf has noticed in a recent overall assessment of Protestant theology in the German-speaking countries and throughout the 20th century. There's a case to make for the existence of a specific war generation of Protestant theologians. But the extent and the exact sort of dates and experiences that fed into this war generation of theologians have yet to be determined, and there is much more empirical research needed to see how this the war as a turning point played out for each a major individual theologian, but also for different strands and schools of theology overall.